today is living with the consequences of a history that is either not fully told or told from only one place. In the world after Gaza, this framework becomes even more radical. Gaza appears not only as a humanitarian tragedy, which it is, but as a moral and a political turning point. An event that confronts the great powers, international institutions, the media and citizens alike, through what they say, what they choose to remain silent about, and how they are heritage suffering. This conversation with Mishra aims precisely at that, to think about the after. To speak about the world of Gaza is ultimately to speak about the kind of world we are building and the kind of questions we are still willing to ask. So I would like to start, Pankaj. The book is born out of an immediate event, yet it presents itself as a historical and moral reflection. What makes Gaza a point of conversation of the global present rather than simply another episode of extreme violence?
Thank you, Javier, and thank you all for coming, and really thank you for your incredibly kind introduction. As you say very eloquently, I wrote this book with a great sense of urgency, not, I hope, too hastily, but the urgency came out of my realization that something extraordinary was happening and that a whole structure of laws, norms, certain human commitments to ordinary decency, all of those were being trampled right in front of our eyes by the world's most advanced democracies, and that this was going to have a devastating effect on not just Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank, but on the entire world. And so, events of the last few months, whether it's the attack on Venezuela, whether it's the proposed war now with Iran, whether it's the crackdown in Minneapolis, whether it's the increased sort of tendencies towards, if not fascism, classical fascism, certainly a kind of authoritarianism of the sort we have not seen before. All of those trends were visible in the way Western democracies endorsed, and not only endorsed, but enabled this extermination campaign of mass extermination in Gaza. Today, we have European leaders expressing alarm over what the United States is likely to do to Greenland or to some part of Latin America. I think it's only a few weeks separate the German Chancellor saying Israel is doing our dirty work, to him saying, oh, this situation in Greenland is very alarming. And what it shows, I think, what it shows is that people in places like Asia or Africa or Latin America who argued all along that the big historical event that has shaped the world, that has shaped the mentalities of people who are dominant in the world today, that was colonialism. It has proven that. The other thing it has proven is something that many people used to say, which was that fascism was perfectly fine for the Europeans as long as the victims of fascism were in Asia or Africa or Latin America. The moment it came to Europe, when Hitler and Mussolini brought it to Europe, and then unleashed it against other Europeans, that is when it became objectionable. And that's what we're seeing today. The moment Trump threatens Greenland, civilization is about to end, and we have literally lived through 2 years of a live stream genocide that all the European leaders were supporting. So I think, in many ways, the insights of people who have been on the periphery of these great historical events of the last 100 years, who have observed Europe and the United States from the perspective of people in a way, both in a way victimized by colonialism, but also able to have an insight into their mentalities, into their way of thinking. Those insights are being verified in real time like never before. And I think Gaza, in that sense, that's why I chose to write it, because also I felt that, the whole project of Israeli colonial expansion, this is the only state in the world whose boundaries are constantly expanding with the help of European powers, with the help of the United States. I think that also, again, posed a whole lot of questions about, what is the role of these so-called democracies? What is the role of the United Nations? What is this, post-1945 structure that we are still living with today? Do we need different international institutions to ensure peace and stability in the world today? Because the United Nations have been rendered ineffective. So there's a whole range of questions that were thrown up by the consensus, the Western consensus in favor of Israel. And I think those questions, instead of going away, have become more oppressively urgent as we speak here today.
Pankaj, you have written for years about the breakdown of the Western liberal narrative. Does Gaza represent for you the definite collapse of that moral framework, or rather the confirmation of a long-sustained hypocrisy?
I think the international liberal order was a kind of disguise, a very pleasant disguise for what were essentially American interests or Western interests. But in the process of upholding this disguise, maintaining this disguise, there was a certain wariness, there was a certain disinclination to use violence in its most naked form. That inhibition was completely abandoned in Gaza. So I think it's there in Gaza that we saw the reality behind these claims of an international liberal order. And again, this was not news to a lot of people who have grown up with the history of a racist, genocidal colonialism in their own countries. What was definitely shocking was that this could happen in the 21st century, that countries who had made such massive, strong claims to being the moral exemplar for the rest of the world, a guide to humanity, a city on the hill, a shining city on the hill, that they would not only support a genocidal state, but also brutally crack down on people in their own countries who were protesting against their actions. And let's not forget, a lot of this was happening, these crackdowns were happening before Trump came to power. So to say that Trump is to blame, as many people do today, for this breakdown, is to utter a lie. Because this breakdown, this sort of destruction of the international liberal order started long before Trump arrived. Trump is a symptom of this breakdown, not the cause of it.
We will talk later about Trump. In the debate over Gaza, many governments, many societies in the global south, or it is known global south, especially think in Latin America, have reacted very different from the West. What do you think this happened? Is a different historical memory of violence, colonialism? What do you think is the reason?
You know, Javier, I wouldn't even say that it's only a different kind of historical experience that makes people in Colombia or Mexico or South Africa or Indonesia or Malaysia respond differently to the situation in Gaza. You know, I have in my home in India, people I know in the village who have absolutely no historical education whatsoever. They left school when they were 10 or 11 years old. Some of them have difficulty reading, but they know about what is happening in Gaza because they can watch it on their screens, on their smartphones. And their question to me has been, how come you know, a country can kill tens of thousands of children and be supported by England and America? They still have an image of these countries as democracies. So I think it's something more basic. It's a sense of shock and a sense of outrage that the people who had claimed to be, who had been accepted as law-abiding and democratic, observant of laws and norms, that they would collaborate in the slaughter of thousands of children is something that shocks people around the world. So you don't have to be, you know, extremely well acquainted with the history of the Middle East or with the history of the Holocaust or with the whether it's European history or Jewish history or Palestinian history. I think most people have been just shocked to see what is really happening on their screens and asking themselves, how can we live in a world where this is allowed, where people can get away with this? And again, you know, there isn't, I suppose, the same investment in certain historical narratives, whether it's the narrative of the Holocaust or whether it's the narrative of Israel as a democracy, or the idea that Israel and the West represent Western civilization. You know, I think obviously there isn't any kind of investment in these narratives, but I think most people are really reacting to, especially young people, you know, who are too young. I see this in my daughter's generation. She's 17 years old. And all the young people in her generation, the people that she goes to school with, are profoundly exercised by this because they just see something terribly wrong being done. You know, Dostoevsky, some of you will remember, raised the question whether it's possible to believe in God after witnessing the suffering of children. Mm-hmm. We've lived through the slaughter of thousands of children, you know. So it raises some very profound questions about what kind of world is this that we are living in.
Yeah, I was telling Pankaj before.
Yo soy español y he estado...
For the last 11, 12 years, I have a friend that always says that now the world is experiencing how to be Mexican, especially with Trump and then. I was going to ask you, like for many European societies, for some of the West, the present moment is experienced as a traumatic rupture of the order, that something that they have not lived in the last 80 years, maybe. But in Latin America, in the Middle East, in South Asia, Africa, of course, instability, political violence, or institutional fragility are not recent phenomena. Do you agree with that? It's like, what and how can Europe react or the West react to something that for many of us is like the day-to-day?
It's a really important question. I think, I can say this for myself as someone, who grew up in India. I didn't leave the country until I was 26 years old. But then very quickly, I established very strong professional relations with the United States. And I think the same is true for many people from middle classes in places like India, Latin America, I would say. But I think our relationship with the United States is one of profound ambivalence. We depend on it because this is a place where you can get educated really well, better than in most cases than in our own countries. This is a place where you're likely to make more money, whether it's writers or artists or in any other profession. This is a place that offers you, it's a cliche to say that, offers you many, many more opportunities than your own country. But at the same time, it's a very tricky relationship because it's a relationship with power. And power can turn against you and humiliate you. And I think for many people in Asia and Africa and Latin America, humiliations for a long time have been part of this relationship with America. The people in Europe have not known that side of the relationship. They've known a long romance with the United States, which has not been compromised by bitterness of the kind people in India or Pakistan have known. A friend in Pakistan says that now the world is finding out what it is like to be a Pakistani. When you are good friends with the United States and you get betrayed again and again and again. So I think Europeans are now discovering the other side of this ambivalent relationship, which is that power can turn against you and degrade you. And then you have to just put up with it. Or you resist. They're trying to decide what they're going to do, but it's very clear that they're going to capitulate because they don't have the power to resist right now. So it's a truly unprecedented historical situation, where a relationship that existed after 1945, after the end of the Second World War, is now breaking rapidly in real time. And Europeans don't know how to respond to it because they have not experienced this other side of this relationship, which is rage, completely sourceless hatred that the Americans now express for Europe. And it's kind of baffling, like, who are these people? Why do they dislike Europe so much? Mm-hmm. The fact is that they were always there. You chose not to look at them. You chose not to notice them. So Europe is certainly in a state of shock right now, and I think it's for me at least looking at it from India, it feels like yes, this is the beginning of a very bitter education.
Many people was impressed and fascinated by Mike Carney's speech last week in Davos, the Canadian Prime Minister, talking about the new order. What do you think about that speech?
I think again, the people who express surprise over that speech are people who have denied themselves the full knowledge of what a liberal international order means. These are people in the political classes of Europe, these are people in the media classes of Europe who have tried to suppress the knowledge that the rest of us have about this liberal international order, which is that it's neither liberal, nor it's international, nor it is an order. It's a kind of disorder. I mean, you think about the country that is supposed to be maintaining the liberal international order. Think about the number of wars it has engaged in over the last few years. The war on terror, displacing, killing millions and millions of people across North Africa, South Asia, the Middle East. Before that, I mean, the long list of interventions, military interventions, coups in Latin America and elsewhere. If this was the liberal international order, you know, what does disorder look like? Perhaps we'll find out now. But you know, I think for me and for many other people, Carney's speech had the same significance as some of you will recall the big speech Nikita Khrushchev gave in 1956 about the crimes of Stalin. By 1956, there was hardly anyone who did not know about the crimes of Stalin. Some people, of course, who were writing for Soviet newspapers tried to suppress it. They would not publish it. But everyone knew the importance of that speech was that it was made by Stalin's successor, a very senior leader in the communist, Soviet communist organization. And I think Carney's speech has the same significance, that he blurted out a truth that has been widely accepted and known for a very long time. But because he's a Canadian Prime Minister, those words have a sort of resonance, again, for a small number of people, but an influential elite, a tiny elite, but an influential one.
In a recent article published in a great Spanish newspaper, you wrote about the de-Americanization. What should we expect of this second Trump administration, taking into consideration what we have seen in just 1 year?
You know, I think when Trump first came to power, there was a lot of discourse in the American press, in the liberal American press, in the New York Times and the New Yorker, a lot of articles trying to claim that Trump is un-American and that he doesn't really, you know, his manners, his principles, his way of speaking, they're all profoundly un-American. I think with the second term, it's become impossible to make the same claim, because it turns out that there are far too many people in the Republican Party, far too many people in Silicon Valley who have the same contempt for ordinary decency, who have the same modes of verbal incontinence. Think about people like Elon Musk, the owner of Palantir, any number of people who are rich and powerful, and you know, some of these are the richest people in the world today, and they happen to be Americans. Listen to their discourses, look at the way they perceive the world, and I think in that sense, what these people represent is a kind of American-style individualism gone mad, a will to power, an individual will to power gone mad. And I think in that sense, I feel like we all need to urgently de-Americanize, because by we I mean people outside of the United States, have embraced certain American ways of being in the world more than we realized. And I'm one of those people. I think a certain kind of emphasis on individual happiness at the expense of the collective good, that has been the general trend in so many of our societies. And that's something that certainly the United States has emphasized in both its sort of, you know, domestic culture and certainly in its foreign posture. It's an ideology that it has very successfully exported to the rest of the world. In a variety of ways, the United States is really an anomaly in human history. It's a completely different society from any other that has ever existed. It's a very new society. It's a society created by immigrants. It's a society created by the social and psychic needs of immigrants, of uprooted people. It's not a good fit. Its values, its principles are not a good fit for people elsewhere who have certain traditions, who have certain ways of being together in communities. And I feel that we need to think very seriously about our infatuation with America. It's not enough to blame Trump. It's not enough to lament what Trump is doing or saying. I think it's a moment for self-reflection. And that's why I wrote that article for El País. Incidentally, I agree. It's for me, it's the best newspaper in the world today, because it is able to entertain ideas of the kind that you won't see in a lot of these magazines and newspapers in the English-speaking world today.
Thank you for your kind words. This is not a sponsor or anything. We are seeing, Pankaj, that the sense of loss of order often translates into fear, retreat, and nostalgia. Is that fear a politically understandable reaction, or a symptom of having failed to seriously think about the world beyond one's own stability?
I think that was also, in a way, the part of the Americanization of the world, which is that I think the habit of thinking of collective welfare, of the larger good, that began to recede from view, that began to fade. And I sort of remember really clearly growing up in India in the 1970s and 80s. We, as you know, achieved our independence from colonial rule in 47. And there was this sort of idea about creating a new society altogether with certain set of values and principles that were not going to be like those of the people who had conquered us. So greed, violence, the kind of ideologies we were exposed to during that whole process of colonial rule, we were going to reject. Now, obviously, it turned out all very differently. But I think the very fact that those principles and values were still being, in a way, invoked by politicians, they were there in our textbooks. These were the values we were supposed to uphold, the values of compassion for other people, of feeling solidarity with the weak and the disadvantaged. All this was being taught all the time, like this is something you have to do. From the 1980s onwards, it very quickly disappeared with the end of history in 1989. That whole ethos completely disappeared, and it was replaced by this idea of pursuing individual happiness, of letting, unleashing the spirits of the marketplace, of competitive individuals competing with each other in the marketplace. That's what is going to make a great society. In retrospect, completely crazy ideas, but they became the dominant ideology in so many societies around the world. And so that's what I mean, like, when you believe that you are on your own against the world, pursuing happiness, then these feelings of fear and the idea of risk, I mean, people have theorized about risk becoming, the new factor in societies. And because, we've stopped believing in the collective good, in the common good. Every individual now has to take on enormous risks, all on their own. And so I think that has, again, led to a lot of psychic distress, which is, not quantifiable. But nevertheless, we've never been as alone as we have been in the last few decades. And it's a very strange thing to say, but since I grew up with a very strong sense of community, with a very strong sense of the collective good. I've become really sensitive to this big change that happened, and this profound loneliness that people in India today know, because they are living now in a hyper-individualistic society.
How can we change, or how can we start to think different, or to change this sense of loneliness that you're talking about?
I mean, I think, by emphasizing, rediscovering the values with which human beings have lived for centuries and centuries, which are like, we are all mutually interdependent. We are not at all, individualism is a lie. We're all profoundly dependent on each other for everything. And that our social arrangements, our political arrangements, our economic arrangements must reflect that basic reality of interdependence. This other thing is really a massive fantasy that only works for a small number of people. It's very clear this huge inequality that exists today, that only a tiny minority has been able to pursue this, individual pursuit of happiness successfully. The rest of us have been left frustrated and angry and lonely. So I think, I think this, the sort of simple realization that we've kind of come very far away from the values that have made for a certain degree of stability and contentment in people's lives.
Coming back to some of the things in the world after Gaza that you can buy it outside, and Pankaj will be signing after this conversation. Let's talk about decolonization. The discourse has gained global traction, but it has also become more diffuse. How can one distinguish between a genuine critic of the colonial legacy and the opportunistic use of anti-colonial language by maybe some authoritarian elites?
That's really hugely important, because again, what we're looking at is an abuse of historical narratives. And I say the same thing about India and many other countries that I say about Israel. The narrative in which the Jewish population of Europe was persecuted, decimated, that narrative does not give legitimacy to the violent expansionism of the State of Israel. Likewise, the fact that the British ruled India for decades and decades were responsible for some of the worst tragedies to befall that country. Many, there's a whole book about the Victorian Holocaust, about famines, devastating famines that consumed millions of lives in India because of what the British were doing there. But none of that justifies what the Indian government does to its minorities or does to its neighbors. And to deal with criticism by saying that this is a form of racism or this is again, people ganging up on India or for that matter, there are other countries I can also think of, is a gross abuse of these historical narratives. And that's why I'm generally wary of these historical narratives. I think it's important to always focus on the present moment and to see who is saying and doing what, and to what extent are they responsible for those actions and sayings in the present. Any kind of justification invoking something that happened in the past is almost always meant to suppress evidence of dishonorable, disreputable acts.
Is there something today recognizable called the Global South? Or is it rather a useful category for naming inequalities that no longer share a common experience?
I think it can be a useful shorthand, but I think, I'm personally wary of extending it too much into, ordinary conversations or discourses. There's not much that is common between India, for instance, or Zimbabwe, between Indonesia and Peru. Yes, there are certain historical experiences that are common to some of these countries. I think primarily amongst those experiences is colonialism and imperialism, and obviously systematic exploitation of these countries by European powers, American powers. But I think today, obviously, those kinds of experiences have a sort of resonance that they didn't have just in the last few decades, and it's partly because the United States has revealed itself to be a nakedly colonialist power. So there's nothing that the global South has done. They've just sort of been simply observing the way, first of all, proxy interests in the Middle East could conduct a genocide before billions and billions of people. And then the United States starts saying that we need Greenland, we need Canada, we might also control Venezuela, maybe some other Latin American countries. So I think it's that has given fresh currency to this idea of the global South, because obviously most of the countries in the global South are small countries. People say China is a member of the global South. It's not. I mean, it is in some ways because of its historical experience, but it's actually now in a different category altogether. But the small countries are fearful. I was in Singapore recently talking to some people in the sort of policy-making world there. And, they said, we've really flourished under the Americans. And now we're terrified, like small countries are terrified. Tomorrow the Americans might sail their big aircraft carrier close to Singapore and demand things from them.
Yeah, the example, I was going to ask you about this kind of amnesia that there are many things happening that since the ceasefire in Gaza, Venezuela, Cuba, Panama, Greenland, Mexico too, but that we forget, or we just forgot what happened in Gaza. Now we are seeing all these pictures of the resorts that they wanna make, but also it seems like the three big countries are playing risk with all of us, and they are dividing the world in three, right? Are you afraid about how things are going, or do you think are going very fast, or how do you feel?
I don't actually agree that the world is being divided up into spheres of influence. Mm-hmm. I think, if you look at the other two big countries, Russia or China, Russia is embroiled in a war in Ukraine that it cannot really win. It's suffered devastating losses. So I think the smallest attempt to intimidate Europe and to force Ukraine to its knees has not really worked out. So the idea that Russia is carving out a sphere of influence, it's got Belarusia. It might get a little bit of Ukraine in this ceasefire arranged by Donald Trump. It doesn't quite amount to a sphere of influence. Chinese leaders have been talking about reunification with Taiwan right from 1949. you can choose to take them as seriously as the Americans do, or one can simply see this as a consistent rhetorical strategy, which is occasionally accompanied by military drills close to Taiwan. But again, you know, if you look at China's relationship with Japan, China's relationship with Vietnam, there are just too many tensions, there are too many problems there for that part of the world to be really China's sphere of influence, even Philippines, Indonesia. So I think the American response is the response of a country that feels itself lagging behind, certainly China, in a range of areas, and you know, the areas which are going to be very crucial, artificial intelligence, most of all. And so I think it's very much, at this point, engaged in cutting off access for China in various parts of the world to the things China wants. So whether it's oil in Venezuela or you know, various trade networks across the Middle East, it's OBR. So it's in a process of encircling China globally. So I think I sort of depart from the sphere of influence argument there. You know, superficially, of course, Trump seems to be saying to Putin, yes, you can have Ukraine, or you can have a part of Ukraine. But that's really it as far as sphere of influence goes.
I think we have time for some questions. We have 10 minutes left. I don't know, podemos abrirlo a preguntas. ¿Alguien tiene?
We can now open up to questions. Does anyone have something they would like to ask or raise with Pankaj?
Hi, Pankaj. Inspiring talk. We're in the middle of an election here in Colombia right now, and there was a debate from the political center candidates a couple of days ago. We're not talking the far right, we're not talking the right, it's supposed to be center, center-right. There were about 10 candidates, and they were asked if they considered there was a genocide in Gaza. 8 of them said no. I'm struggling to understand why. I believe that apparently talking about genocide in Gaza has become a left-wing thing here in Colombia. But I wanted to ask you if you can see any explanation to this type of rhetoric where there is a denial, a systematic denial of the Holocaust in a society like ours.
I have to say, I'm really surprised to hear that. I thought that was a settled consensus in this part of the world, in this country. But you know, I've been also struck by politicians in the United Kingdom, for instance, doubling down on this particular denial. And a very cynical explanations suggests itself to me, which is that there is absolutely no incentive, professional or otherwise, in saying publicly that there is a genocide. In fact, the disadvantages are numerous. If you are a politician in the United Kingdom, I will speak about the United Kingdom, I don't know enough about Colombia to speculate, but it's very clear in the UK, politicians there in the main, I don't know if you're following the politics there, the two mainstream parties are imploding. I mean, we are, as I keep saying, we're living through world historical events. So the Conservative Party, Labour Party are both collapsing. And these, you know, resurgent parties on the right to a great extent and some on the left are emerging. So the people who are in power know that their days are numbered. Very soon, they will be looking for jobs in the corporate sector. They will come to Silicon Valley, and many of them already have connections and so on. And there, in those places, criticism of Israel is not only not going to get you anywhere, is going to get you completely ruled out. So the British Chancellor, just a few weeks ago, went and spoke at a group called Labour Friends of Israel and stood there and says, I will always stand with Israel. Can you imagine a politician ever saying this? I will always stand with Rwanda. I will always stand with Serbia. But this is the level of, shamelessness and impunity. And it's because these people know that they'll be out in the next election. And the kind of life they want for themselves is not going to be facilitated by taking a principled position on this issue. Quite the contrary.
As a part of the new generation, we're constantly facing challenges like AI, massive communication, globalization, and I think our role, it's not really defined yet because we're gonna suffer the consequences of people in power right now in a few years. So what do you think are the responsibilities that we as a new generation have to do or take to prevent these human tragedies from keep happening as we have seen in the last few years?
It's really difficult for me to even, list the responsibilities that an older generation has, in a way, imposed on the younger generation. Because I know my generation and the generation older than mine and a generation slightly younger than mine has really messed up, has been guilty of getting things wrong, of doing a lot of things that has made this world a really horrible and violent and disorderly place. And as a father of a teenage daughter right now, I really constantly despair about the amount of work that she and her generation are confronted with at this point. A massive cleaning up operation, every realm, whether it's politics, it's business, it's these future challenges of artificial intelligence. Everywhere you see massive, formidable obstacles. And the old are entrenched in their positions, refusing to vacate those positions. The young still are not in positions of power. They have a lot of energy. They have a lot of moral conviction. They have a lot of principles, a lot of things that my generation lacked, but they're not in positions of power yet. So it's a very difficult question for me because I feel like it's horribly unfair that the young should be asked to assume these responsibilities today in a world that is falling apart. But there is no option but to reach out and to embrace those responsibilities, to go out and meet this future that is coming very fast towards us. There's no point in just passively sitting there and waiting for it to come and crush you. It's better to be aware of all these things that are going to happen and to think about how we're going to survive all that and to start thinking today. And this is what these conversations, writing, books, this is what it's all about. Journalism, that's what it should be all about, is how do we prepare the generations that are going to be in positions of power to meet these responsibilities, to discharge these massive responsibilities.
Thank you.
Mr. Mishra, leyendo los romances.
Reading the romantics and books like The Age of Rage, we can conclude that with everything that's written, it's a fair and just criticism to modernity. And you, in one of your books, state that you are stepson of the Western. And the West, and we can see the footprints that confirm that. Anarin, Thought, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, they are going to appear. But there's one that calls my attention because it's very, very lagging behind, which is Rousseau. There's a quote from Rousseau in The Age of Rage that says, the financial system makes venal men, creates hypocrites and traitors that really sell the morals and the goods. To what extent that thought that has more than 200 years is still today?
You know, I have a partiality for those kinds of statements, and it has to do with my upbringing in a community in India where it was a very particular community where the idea of learning about the world and the idea of knowledge was sacred, and money making was looked down upon, and seen, even money was seen as the root of all evil. So I sometimes think that I've been over-influenced by that kind of upbringing into, constantly being critical of a world in which money-making, economic expansion, economic growth, the businessman is the hero. I find it quite repellent at one level, that is the world we have to live in, where we have to constantly see the face of Elon Musk every day and follow his. And so the tyranny of these plutocrats over our lives, over now our inner lives, these are people running social media companies and now controlling our minds and souls like never before. Completely undistinguished people, uncultured, illiterate people, but they have money. So I think, this kind of statement I'm always attracted to, and when you see it verified in the societies we live in today, it's sort of hard to actually give up those prejudices. But thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I just have a short question. I was wondering, what is your opinion of the peace treaty promoted by President Trump, and how do you think this situation of peace will evolve? What would be the outcome at a long term?
So how is going to evolve all this situation with Trump?
I'm as uncertain as anyone else at this point, because it's such a new situation in that Europeans have considered themselves very much part of this, powerful world with America at the top. And again, every European politician, almost every European journalist I know has links with America. There's family there, they've been educated there, or they go there a lot. So this rejection, this brutal rejection, has come as such a great shock to the European elite. And, also I think, this is another argument altogether, they've also been Americanized in such profound ways that it's more difficult for them to, in a way, than people in Latin America or Asia and Africa to kind of break free of America. And I'm not just talking here about military dependence or economic dependence, but I think spiritually, Europe has been Americanized in a way no other part of the world has been. I just remember when I first went to the UK, how shocked I was to see the influence of America everywhere. I thought that Europeans had a lot more autonomy, cultural autonomy or sort of, intellectual autonomy. but wasn't the case. So I think because of this dependence, they are paralyzed at this stage, and still hoping, still hoping. And this is, I think Carney's speech was, in a way, quite shocking for a lot of Europeans, because he said, nostalgia is not a strategy. That's what he said, didn't he? And so that's a wake-up call. But like, what do you wake up to, and what do you do next after waking up? I don't think they know, or anybody knows at this point.
Yeah, one last question, maybe.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I read your statements saying that you had come back to novel after several very important essays, because it didn't make sense to continue writing essays due to the devaluation of truth. Nonetheless, you have published this wonderful essay on the world after Gaza, Age and Anger. Talk about the debate, internal debate, between choosing fiction, essay, to speak to the world.
For reminding me of my resolution. But it was I think about it every day. And, this book, I really wrote because I felt compelled to write it. It was really a question of saving myself from madness. I think, I say in the book, a lot of people were just going mad during that time, witnessing everything that was going on. And at the same time, watching politicians, journalists deny what was happening. So you were left, you were doubting yourself all the time and thinking, is this what I'm seeing? Is this really true? Could this be true? Nobody else seems to be acknowledging it. So it was really almost a desire to survive that I thought I can only spend the day by focusing on a piece of paper and writing. So I had to give up my, kind of resolve to only write fiction. And so I ended up writing another nonfiction book. But, I have to say, I think because writing about these subjects exposes you to so much atrocity, not just atrocity in physical violence, murder, or torture, but also intellectual atrocity of people openly lying, people openly justifying horrific acts of violence. And it takes, I think, it takes a huge toll on your mind and your soul. So I feel writing this book, I've become much older and more tired. And I keep thinking, is this my fate to keep writing about these really quite demoralizing and ultimately soul-destroying things? Should I continue? Should I do something else? But these are the questions you have to constantly wrestle with. But that resolution is always there, kind of making me, consoling me, making me think, yes, it's there, it's alive, I can go back to it at some point. But thank you.
Are you working on something new, or you?
¿Estás trabajando en un nuevo proyecto o no quieres envejecer tanto? Pues la verdad es que en este momento no tengo un proyecto en curso. Pankaj, ha sido...
Thank you so much for accepting this conversation. Pankaj estará firmando afuera.
Pankaj will be signing books outside the auditorium. Thank you all very much and have a good afternoon.